Hello, my name is Andrew Penner, and I am the president of the AEE Canada East chapter. Before we get going, I'd just like to give a shout out to our sponsors. So sponsors are so important to chapters like ours. They enable us to fulfill our mission financially. Through their support, they confirm our relevance and provide credibility. They espouse to our members. They espouse our members to new ideas. Expose our members to new ideas and ways of thinking, and they help grow our network and influence. This is our first webinar of 2024, and what you see on the screen here is the stable of great companies who have stood up our chapter. So we want to give a shout out to these guys for supporting us, and there are a few more kind of in the pipeline. And if you don't see your company there, but you think it should be there, we encourage you to reach out. As a chapter of the Association of Energy Engineers, the AEE Canada East looks to espouse the mission and values of AEE. We are the local expression of AEE, and for some, we represent their sole window into the international association. As an association, AEE was founded in 1977, so it's been around for a good long time. It has grown to include more than 18,000 members across more than 100 countries, and there's over 90 chapters just like ours. Now, without further ado, we'd like to kind of introduce today's topic. So today's webinar is focusing on solar PV and batteries and the marriage of those two technologies. Our presenter today is Vadim. He's a senior energy systems project manager at JL Richards. He's worked in solar, wind, and buildings energy efficiency fields for over 30 years. So he's got lots and lots of experience across a wide array of projects. So we would love for you, Vadim, to take over the webinar and share with us your ideas.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew. Let me share my screen. Yes, again, thank you very much for joining. Very pleased to have this opportunity, and thanks to Andrew for the introduction. The talk is about solar and batteries, basically design and benefits of commercial facilities. I'll be speaking a bit about residential as well. The intent here is to provide information for engineers and technical staff, but it's going to be relatively high level. I hope we can just skim over enough topics and materials to make it interesting. Now, JL Richards is the company that I work for. It's based in Ottawa, Ontario, is our head office. We have 6 other offices around Ontario, about 450 people, engineering, planning, architecture. And in the last 6 or 7 years, we've developed an internal innovative energy group that focuses on energy services of all kinds, basically advisory services, um, energy and carbon in buildings, environmental infrastructure, mining, and renewable energy and supply and storage. And it's the renewable energy part that I work in. So I think this is. Are you actually seeing, Andrew, if you can tell me if you're seeing the full screen?
We're seeing the proper presentation.
Yeah, because it's okay. I was worried that it was cut off, but it seems to be okay again. So this is, at least the slide on the right is an old one by Richard Perez, who is very much kind of an icon of solar energy through his modeling satellite work on solar resource. But it shows the stunning differences in the availability of renewable energy versus finite fossil fuel resources on Earth. And especially on the solar side, you see that it obviously drafts it all, or dwarfs it all in terms of the annual availability of clean renewable energy available. By comparison, the fossil fuel uranium uh, sources here uh, are finite, so they're being shown here in their full availability for their um, entire capacity on Earth. So uh, when it comes to PV modules, again, I'm not going to spend much time on exploring that. I think a lot of you probably know PNN junctions much perhaps better than I do. But we're basically talking about this magical material that, when hit by light, releases electrons to move into a circuit and create current. And it's something that's uh, been around for quite a long time, since the early space program in the 60s and 70s, and has uh, improved. I would say more incrementally than anything. It's the pricing that's improved wildly, but the technology itself has grown incrementally to where now, even say 10 years ago, we were looking at maybe 15, 16% efficiencies. Now we're sort of conventionally installing modules at 20, 21, 22% efficiencies. The size of the modules has increased somewhat, but because of the greater physical size and the greater efficiencies, whereas 10 years ago we would have been looking at 200, 300 watt modules. Now we're looking at 500 and 600 watt modules. So it's become more efficient to install. Um, Maybe the other, I'm not going to get into the variants other than bifacial cells, which is something that is increasing in terms of application, and it's basically a module that the modules are provided with a glass backing as opposed to an opaque backing, and that allows that allows light to be absorbed from both sides of the module and gives you some extra benefit, and especially for ground mount applications where you have good opportunities for albedo, for reflectance. Um, we're seeing more and more of those, so that's one significant change. Um, that's quite observable. In terms of PV system components, no need to go into them individually, but this is the good overview. Um, One of the points here that's interesting is that it's really the inverters that uh, are the only, I wouldn't say weak point, but the point that needs the most maintenance and attention during the lifetime of the system. Typically, inverters are replaced, or are at least you plan to replace them every 15 years. Some will go sooner, some will go later. Um, but otherwise, it's all solid state electronics, no moving parts, very dependable systems. In terms of scale, you're seeing here the typical um, range of scale where you can have a behind the meter installation like this residence, or you can have towns or neighborhoods being served by the distribution grid, and the distribution grid being fed by solar, or alternatively, you have very large commercial, industrial scale renewable energy applications that connect directly to transmission lines. This is one of our team colleagues fairly recently came back from a trip to Tanzania, where she was working for for a little bit on the very smallest of the systems, and it's always very satisfying to get your hands involved in that manner. Um, Typical PV system configurations here. You've got your behind the meter configuration where your PV connects to your electrical panel that feeds the building loads and allows, in most cases, allows electricity to also go on the grid. So that will be a net metering, virtual net metering, or a load displacement scenario. Uh, then there is in front of the meter, which is for your large commercial systems that are typically connected to the directly to either the transmission or distribution grid, and that's something that you'd do through a power purchase agreement with the off taker. The user of the electricity, or with a market generator. Uh, a little more detail here on these various configurations. So in front of the meter, you're selling 100% of the power to the grid. You're essentially a producer, an industrial producer of renewable energy. Uh, Virtual net metering um, is something that we still don't have in Ontario, but hopefully will come soon. Which basically means that solar produced at one site may be used by sorry, may be used by another site. Mm. And this would allow developers to develop projects that are not directly connected to the end user, um, because that is what we have in Ontario and a lot of other jurisdictions as well, is the net metering configuration, which basically limits you to having your solar either on your own roof, the facility that uses the power, or on your property. Could be your basically your backyard, front yard, what have you. Um, and then there's load displacement, which is a yet more limited version of that, um, where no export is allowed to the grid. So these rules and regulations, sorry about that. I have a frog in my throat, I guess, as they say. Rules and regulations. If net metering is, or if only net metering is allowed, if you can't do anything beyond that, then, oops, here we go. Then you'd have something like this situation in Ottawa, multi-tenant warehouse, um, where there may be four, five, six tenants using the space, and if they want solar, each one is allowed to put up as much solar as their facility consumes, which in this case would be four, five, six small PV arrays. Whereas if you have virtual net metering, a developer can make arrangements with the owner of the building, or the owner of the building themselves can do this, and make arrangements with buyers of electricity elsewhere off site, and basically fill up as much roof as they have. Um, Rooftop types here, flat roofs, very common. Often the biggest commercial roofs available in urban areas. Here's the pictures. You may not see them all too great, but it's an interesting example of a project that JLR recently worked on, where with the region of Halton on a wastewater treatment plant, where we were identifying rooftops, flat rooftops, for them to put PV on at um, over a dozen such plants. So you could see everything from storage tanks to buildings. Now, sloped roofs, like this is a architectural uh, concept drawing for a Cornwall net zero building that we worked on. Um, that um, that is definitely a very common application as well. Standing seam metal roofs are probably the easiest to handle when it comes to sloped, because you can basically you forego the need for a racking system. The panels are clamped directly onto um, the standing seams of the roof. And also, whereas in the past, when panels were expensive, you really did your best to put them oriented south for maximum solar gain. Now, with the prices coming down, it's often more advantageous to actually consider other orientations, to consider even a slightly northerly facing area would potentially be usable. It's not going to be as efficient in generating solar electricity, but still, um, but it maximizes capacity and gives you more energy for your site. Small ground mount applications. So this is where you have solar installed on a racking system on the ground, and these could be either fixed racking systems or tracking systems. Typically these days, for smaller systems, you do see a lot of single axis trackers. um, Dual axis trackers are possible as well. Um, I'll, I suppose just to make a comment here about the unbuildable urban lands, that's this City of Saskatoon project was looking to fill up very um, sort of a strangely shaped piece of land that the city wasn't using for any other purpose, and ground mount PV would have been perfect there. Um, some of the newer opportunities are building integrated PV, BIPV. That's where basically the panels can be incorporated into your uh, architectural panels, into railings, sound barriers, what have you. The solar panels can also be tinted in various ways to provide various color accents. They can be partially transparent, where there's a mix of clear glass and PV cells, which just allows the architects a lot of leeway. Um, Another interesting application that's becoming more and more common. It's right now. It's really more. You see this a lot more in the southern states, uh, where there's no snow and a lot of sun, but solar parking canopies or carports, whatever you want to call them. Um, but they are used in Canada as well. This was a National Defense Campus headquarters project that we did a design for. It has not been built at this point, but there are definitely many parking canopy projects in in Canada now. Shedding snow is always a concern, and this is what's pictured here actually as a design to minimize any kind of damage that may be caused by that. So the really the big news, and that everybody, I think, over the last few years really has been hearing, is how much the price of solar modules has dropped. Um, this chart on the left shows that it's basically 400 time 400 um, times less than it was in the late 1970s. Um, there was a bit of a spike in prices recently with the pandemic, like with everything. But then this chart on the right also shows you model solar module prices, quite recent ones in last year, starting to drop yet again. Long and I think this is probably the last slide on the solar, but it just to drive home the point how um, uh, uh, how, how solid the product really is, the solar modules, that most companies have always warranted performance for a 20-year lifetime. At this point, a lot of companies are warranting 25 years performance, and some are going to 30. Um, and even though you're not at the end of 25, 30 years, your panel is not going to be performing as it did on day one. It's still going to be in the 85, uh, 80% range, which is really incredible to think of a product being on your roof, having all of the elements of weather hitting it year in year out, performing that well. Uh, Impact of snow, yeah, I should definitely mention that. That's often a question, of course, in our climates. Um, Jail Richards has had many reasons, from big power plants to smaller installations, to look into um, snow losses, or losses in production due to snow. And we've developed our own models, validated them with hundreds of um, uh, systems data, and basically we're seeing for Ontario in this case, everything above this blue line being in the higher snow loss area, about 4% to 10%, whereas everything to the south, which really still includes most of the population, is only in the 3% losses category. That's an annual loss. Now, you also have to keep in mind that your winter production for solar, even without any snow losses, would only be about 15% of your annual, just because of the sun position and short days. So these losses are not not all that bad, and they are basically incorporated at the modeling to make sure that the project still that the project still hits all of its economic goals. So speaking of project economics, we've typically used this life cycle costing analysis, um, and this is basically just an example of a mid-size system, 120 kilowatt DC in Ontario, on a net metering configuration with no further with no subsidies. I mean, net metering is not a subsidy. No, there's no um, government incentives thrown into that, and it would give you positive cash flows around year 12, which basically means that for the rest of the time, 17 years or thereabouts, you're having essentially free electricity from your site. So at year 12, it has paid back its initial investment, and continues from there on. Another way of looking at project economics is this very interesting graph that shows the location of different cities in Canada relative to what the levelized cost of energy would cost from solar in those cities, so that takes into account the solar installation in those cities. Primarily, that makes a big difference here. Is as you go further up north, less sun uh, causes basically a higher levelized cost of energy, and then at the same time, the vertical axis shows carbon intensity um, for electricity. So the cities in roughly in this area in are are fairly clean electricity grids, and whereas it's the cities in the upper section that probably require the most. It's I was going to say require the most support, but it's not financial support. It's more that you get the most benefit in terms of GHGs by going to solar there. Another interesting perspective is for large scenarios, large project scenarios in Ontario. Um, a lot of large users, industrial users, but also some institutional users, like we're working with the University of Ottawa right now. They're on uh, Class A rate structure, which basically focuses on how much that user is impacting the provincial peak, grid peak, and to a lesser degree on their actual kilowatt hour consumption. So here you see the ISO, it's independent electricity supplier. No, it's not supplier. Sorry, I'm just blanking out here the, on the terminology, but it's basically the regulatory body that studying the grid and controls the grid. So uh, they track grid performance and peak heights, and this is what this dashed black line represents. Um, the uh, vertical gray lines represent peaks on those days, and the orange is solar production on those days, typical solar production. So even though the peaks don't exactly coincide with utility peaks, they coincide to about 40 or 50%, meaning that about 40 or 50% of the peak kilowatt rating of your solar system would be available during grid peak, and that makes a very significant cost contribution to your facility's bills. So just very quick summary of the benefits. I think we don't need to spend too much time on it. Um, you this one of turning existing assets into generation capacity is very important, because you've got, especially in an urban setting, so many roofs that are still uh, underutilized, can be utilized for this, and of course there's lots of land around. So carefully vetted, carefully selected land for using ground mount PV. Um, Generation can be overbuilt, meaning you can put in more DC capacity, meaning more solar panels than um, actual AC capacity, and that helps with the economics. Um, it's The generation may not be. People often talk about the changeable nature of solar or wind generation, but generation is quite predictable on a monthly and annual scale. Um, Deployed anywhere in the world at all scales, um, and very short construction times and low O&M. Those are some of the other key elements here. So lots of potential still remaining. Challenges: no overnight production, obviously, and we'll get into batteries in a second. Low predictability on an hourly scale for any particular location, because at that point you're trying to predict the weather for the day, and the fact that it really does. There is a paradigm shift there from centralized electricity generation to distributed generation owned by many, and that paradigm shift is still very much ongoing. Um, so the last portion here is on battery energy storage. Um, I think unless Andrew wants to interject with questions, we might as well hold off questions till the end. Um, so this analogy that we often use for batteries is you could think of it as a Swiss Army knife, in that it's a tool for many applications, many reasons to have battery energy storage. Or you can also think of it as bacon, in that it goes with everything. The deployment scale of battery energy storage, or BESS, pretty much supports those analogies as well. You can have residential BESS at 1 to 10 kilowatts, and that's most famously the Tesla Powerwall falls in that category. You can have the behind the meter 1 to 20 megawatt um, solutions that are essentially containerized battery solutions, or grid connected BESS up to 300 megawatt and rising. Um, System configuration are somewhat similar, like with solar, is that you can have it behind the meter, which is typically the smaller systems, and they would be used for peak shaving, meaning reducing the demand peak, kilowatt peak on the utility, and therefore your rates. Backup power, demand response, energy arbitrage. Um, Energy arbitrage is you're basically kind of playing the market for seeing where the rates go, and if you have power in your batteries during expensive times, you sell the power then. If you don't have power during cheap electricity times, you charge your batteries and wait for a better selling point. And then you have your larger in front of the meter systems, the PV and BESS generation systems, demand response, grid support are some of the applications, the benefits um, that come from that. Again, sort of an overview of functionality. Front of meter, it really can um, for front of the meter, it really can serve pretty much any use that the utility has for it, and the more advanced the utilities that sort of have the most advanced policies will use those policies to incent the use of batteries to give them the benefits they need, whether it's demand response or better um, better, cleaner electricity quality. Whereas the behind the meter applications are, they have some of those elements as well, but um, they really sort of depend on what you want as a client at your facility, whether it's backup power or peak shaving. I guess the main thing to mention here is that once uh, battery system is installed, the the controls are essentially software controls and can be configured in multiple, very wide range of ways to provide you these benefits. Challenges are the costs, especially for long duration technologies, market regulations that don't always encourage batteries. And then again, this issue of the paradigm shift that's really just happening now and is a bit behind the paradigm shift. Excuse me here, I've got, okay, sorry for the background noise. Uh, so some examples: region of Halton, Oakville Water Treatment Plant. This is a JLR project where we've provided, with other partners, services from concept engineering to detailed engineering, IFC drawings, um, and uh, and working on contract administration. So you've got your staged approach, phased approach to installing PV, because there's more potential for PV than what the client wants to handle on a first go. Um, and you have the opportunity to install battery energy storage for peak shaving and for standby power. So everything gets integrated into a new substation, and grid peak prediction services is also one of the services that we play a role in providing. Concord Green Energy in Athabasca, Chippewa, and First Nation. There were 3 sites, each roughly 20 to 30 megawatts each, that were built out initially as solar plants, and then lithium ion batteries were added after the fact. Or actually being still being completed as we speak. And our role, JLR's role, was as an independent engineer on this site. So it's basically the purpose of the BESS is to give the developer experience with, to optimize electricity sales, because it is a open market in Alberta, and in terms of when and how you want to sell your power. So having sufficient battery storage allows you to time your sales to coincide with highest electricity pricing. Other configurations and deployment opportunities that we've seen, that we actually see a lot of potential for, is the vehicle to grid model, where as the fleet of EVs increase, you do have this potential for especially nighttime, either charging or discharging as required in feeding the grid. But this electric school bus system is particularly interesting because, and we've just are in the process of working with one company introducing electric school buses in Ontario because in the summertime, obviously, most of the buses are parked and do not get used. So they represent uh, a very good, significant energy storage potential to be used to support the peaks and just the grid in general. Um, and the other thing that's very much up and coming is just that commercial PV plants have been and are cost competitive now with gas peaker plants. So that's obviously another sector of the market that will continue to grow. In terms of some comments on the environment and economics, um, as I mentioned previously, most PV is silicon based. And of that, you have your materials composition here, 76% glass, etc. A lot of this is obviously recyclable. Um, and in terms of energy paybacks, people are often concerned, say, well, PV is all well and good, but how many years of carbon equivalence does a PV panel actually represent? And there's been a number of studies over the years that show that consistently show that those numbers are actually quite low. So here you have a cadmium telluride panel that's 2 to 3 months, and the more common silicon panels are in the 6 to 7 months carbon payback, energy payback. Um, Also, this this graph or this chart is interesting in that it shows the PV module waste here between a best case scenario and 54 million metric tons versus a worst case of 160, and how that compares to other waste streams from other industrial and consumer sectors. That This brings us just to a very quick overview of some of the funding opportunities and grant opportunities available to different types of clients. Um, this is a field that shifts quite often. Programs come and go. Some of these have been around though for a while. Certainly, Federation of Canadian Municipalities. On the other hand, the federal import tax credit is fairly new and still being worked out. So, worked out in terms of where it's making the most impact. Um, but governments do understand the benefit of PV and batteries and are generally trying to find ways to incent those programs. So in conclusion, technologies, BESS and PV technologies are very much grid competitive. Um, they have multiple values and functions, from GHG reductions to fast deployment, scalability, environmental benefits. Um, the rate and structure and regulatory constraints matter very much. As you move across Canada from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, these will be different, and the solar and energy storage markets will be different as well by consequence. Um, And finally, that even though these technologies in most Canadian markets are cost effective, um, to increase their their uptake essentially, and um, to grow this market further, there are funding and third party um, opportunities available to whether it's grants or financing mechanisms. So that's that for the presentation itself, and I do want to put in a word that we are JLR is in fact hiring. So anybody interested, very happy to hear from you. So Andrew.
Yeah, that's really great. Thanks for bringing all that information to us. I do have a question. There's actually one question that came up, but I'm going to ask a different question first. So, in the context of having batteries and generation, like when you're approaching a project, is there a rule of thumb, or is there some sort of indicator that would give you an inkling that pairing the two technologies together is going to make sense, or is it really something that you have to evaluate on a case by case basis?
Uh, I mean, in most cases, there's definitely a lot of evaluation required on a case by case basis, but in sort of larger categories, you can see, uh, for example, there's a market on the residential side with whether it's the Tesla Powerwall or other manufacturers. Um, if you're a homeowner for whom the benefits are important, um, then by all means go, you want to take a look at that. You want to compare it, see how much PV you can have as well. Um, on the commercial and industrial side of it, a lot of the batteries, I think, the majority of the batteries right now are being installed for what people sometimes call GA busting, which is your um, GA pricing element of your hydro rates that depends on demand, and so having batteries on hand to uh, take over your peak demands in those times will give you the benefits that you're looking for. Now, you often uh, I think there's probably more batteries installed now without PV than with PV. I'm not. I might be. Hopefully, I'm wrong on that, but that's sort of my sense, because just this difference in hydro rates was enough to drive battery economics. Um, but then, if you couple that with PV, you have additional benefits as well. So very much case by case.
What kind of what's the what is your typical client look like? Are they the altruists? Are they doing this because they've created some sort of a commitment and they're trying to make good on that? Like, what does the profile of a typical client look like?
Yeah, I would say the altruists and people doing it because it's the right thing to do are probably much more limited to homeowners and individuals. Once it comes to larger systems, it's economic drivers that are in charge quite clearly. As said, like with battery technology, you have a lot of people operating, like a production facility of some sort of a factory, paying thousands of dollars of fees to hydro because they're just basically because their production is high enough on these five coincident peaks. Installing a battery is almost a no-brainer. Some companies are sort of pushing that end of the market. Some companies say, well, try to expand your benefits by also adding PV and having clean energy in the mix. But it ultimately pretty much always rides on commercial considerations.
Awesome. There was a question earlier on in the presentation. You had been describing or listing off different types of cells, different types of technology, kind of on the generation side. And it was pointed out that you may have omitted a PSC type of cell. And I, forgive me, I'm not in this industry, so I don't even know if I can pronounce this, but it's a perovskite. Is that Does that ring a bell to you? Is that a
It
deliberate
rings.
omission, or is it just something that is evolving in time?
Uh, you're saying as a yeah, no, it does ring a bell, but that's about it at this point.
Okay,
I've I'm not involved at that level of the technologies. But my general overview is I've been involved with projects for many years, uh, and promising. I guess I'll really I'll know about the technologies once they hit the commercial mainstream, and there's been some technologies that had been promising for quite a long time that have not made that in the end. That the good old simple, so to speak, silicon module, for example,
sure.
the economics of it had pushed out any other competitors.
When you're choosing a tech like a panel type or technology, like is it a catalog play, or like how do you guys go about that as the engineer of record, figuring out what the right kind of
Mm.
configuration and technology is for the application?
Yeah, we'll basically, I'd say the two main drivers are that it has to be, in most cases, a tier one supplier, meaning just sort of the highest kind of recognized quality of suppliers, and there's a number of organizations, I think the US, California specifically, that rate suppliers on various factors. A lot of it technical and longevity and warranty adherence and such, but some also rate suppliers on environmental benefits. So that depending on what the client is looking for, that allows um, some cutting down of the whole scope into something more manageable. But then obviously price becomes very important as well. Um, Panels are essentially a global commodity. Prices go up and down sort of on a micro level almost all the time, depending what suppliers you're dealing with, depending on the size of your purchase. You might, like, if you're in the smaller a megawatt or smaller range, uh, just it's not a hard number, but just throwing that out, you're typically dealing with resellers, and their prices might be a bit more stable. Whereas if you're doing a big project and you're talking about multiple megawatts, you might be able to go more directly to a manufacturer or deal with a representative of a manufacturer that'll allow for better pricing. So it's quite a mix of factors.
Yeah, very good. I guess one more question that comes top of mind, and there aren't any others that came in from the audience, so I'm going to ask it. You, in some of your examples, I mean, you had some kind of large generation, kind of grid connect application. You also showed some kind of more kind of behind the meter applications, right, on roofs and on properties for business owners. From your perspective, like oftentimes we're hearing criticisms of renewable energy that the sun doesn't shine when you need the power, or the wind doesn't blow when you need the power. And I think my observation is that perhaps batteries helps to level that out, right? It helps to
Mhm.
store that energy for use, when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing. But from what you've seen in the marketplace, is this is this application strategy something that we should be doing at the grid scale for large generation, or is it really best distributed out kind of in a behind the meter strategy?
I think both. I think especially when you see it, look at it from a climate perspective, we want to be doing everything as much as possible in parallel. Uh, but frankly, you do have markets, very significant markets on both sides of the meter, as it were. Um, um, the 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 batteries, the battery, considering where we are, especially in Canada, where our solar build out is still relatively small, and we still have a long way to go. Um, I think we definitely in the short term, I'd say in the medium term, there's really no limits to how much solar we well there's always there's technical limits depending exactly where you're interconnecting and what have you, but in the bigger sense, there's very little limit to how much we can install. Like, all provincial utilities can still handle a lot more solar, and luckily batteries have, you could say, come at just the right time. Battery prices are falling as well. New battery technologies are coming out. um, that this is a great opportunity for the two technologies to be installed side by side where possible. I mean, it's in Ontario. It's really just in the last few years that the utility, um, Hydro One, others have started investing large amounts in like 200, 300 megawatt sized batteries to just to support the grid, not even independent of solar. Um,
Excellent. Well, I mean, I think it's an evolving kind of marketplace, I think, and I'm really happy that you're able to kind of bring some practical and real examples of the work being done across the country. So Vim, thanks for making the time to chat with us today and to share your insights and your experiences, and um, I hope it was informative for those who tuned in and stayed for the duration. If you want to see something again, this presentation will end up on our YouTube channel, so we'll make sure that that's there and all tidied up. And yeah, well, thank you again, Vadim, for your time, and we wish everybody a pleasant rest of their day.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Andrew, and thanks to everybody for attending.
Very good. Bye now.
Bye bye.